Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to allprophecyfulfilled.com on the World Wide Web and on Facebook. Simply All Prophecy Fulfilled. Okay, we are continuing in our series called The ABCs of Bible Prophecy. Two things while I'm thinking of it. Number one, I realized in that last video I cut my head like right about there, cut it off. I'm sorry, I know that's irritating. My bad, won't happen again. Don't want to deprive you of this beautiful head of hair. Secondly, that was a pretty long video, 15 to 16 minutes, something like that. Again, I apologize. I really want to keep these down to about 6 or 8 minutes. I will do my best. So let's get cracking. Okay, in that first video, you might recall that I distinguished the difference between historical eschatology and covenant eschatology. And I presented the idea, and I'm going to continue to demonstrate this as we go, that the Bible is focused primarily on redemptive history or salvation history or covenantal history, not world history. And that's why the Bible is focused primarily on Old Covenant, Old Testament Israel and the nations surrounding her that she came into contact with. That's the point. There was an Old Covenant established through them. God would bring salvation to all mankind through them. So for a time, that was the means through which God covenanted with people. But that covenant world was going to be brought to an end with the entrance of another. And see, that's really the point I'm getting at. With another new covenant. And, you know, the Bible never goes any further or looks any further beyond in history other than to describe that new covenant and describe life in that new covenant, in the New Jerusalem, the heavenly city where the gates are always open and the nations are flowing into it, but we'll get there. Okay, I mentioned the death that entered the world through Adam. And I wasn't referring to physical death. Now I realize that's a little bit on the controversial side, but I was referring to alienation from God. So let me just touch on that quickly. You might say, now wait a minute. What does the death in Adam have to do with the Old Covenant or the Old Covenant law with Israel? Because Adam is way over here, and centuries later, you have the entrance of the Mosaic economy. You know, so what's the deal with that? Well, let's not forget what Paul said, and I shared this last time, Romans chapter 5, starting around verse 12 through 14. He said, therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and the death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world. But sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses. Okay, so death reigned from Adam until Moses, and then what? Then it didn't? It quit? Well, no. Quite the opposite, actually. Paul tells us what happened with Moses and the entrance of the law. In Romans chapter 7, 7 through 11, 7 through 12, Paul said that he would not have come to know sin except through the law. Then he went on to say that sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, produced in him coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin is dead. He said that he said, quote, I guess, I was alive once apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin became alive and I died. Then he goes on to explain that it was through the commandment that he was deceived, and as Paul puts it, it killed me. So I think what Paul's doing here, actually, in my opinion, I think what he's doing here is I think he's making his life parallel or analogous with that of Israel itself. But in any case, Paul says in Galatians 3:13 that the redemption that Christ brought was redemption from the curse of the law. And then later on in verse 19, he goes on to say that the law was added because of transgressions. Until when? Until the seed would come to whom the promise had been made. Then in 2 Corinthians 3:7, Paul calls the old covenant, or Torah, if you will, the ministry of death, or ministration of death. The very death brought in by and through Adam. And then how about that infamous resurrection passage that we all love so much and we all know so well in 1 Corinthians chapter 15? Well, in verse 56, Paul says that the sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. Now, could there be a connection between the law and the doing away with the law and resurrection? I think there might be, and we're gonna get to that. So do you see the relationship here? Do you see what God's doing here? We have the death of Adam eventually being placed into or placed under the law of Moses. Just like that. They're attached. And what did that do? Well, I think it made it worse. It exacerbated the problem, if you will. Because knowledge of sin and death through the lens of the law only made those under it more aware or maybe accountable of the sin and the death and their alienation from God. And it was magnified, if you will. Okay, so what am I saying here? Victory over death and the kind of righteousness that God required could not be accomplished through the law. Instead, victory over death and righteousness would have to be attained another way. Death and the law were now partners, if you will, in crime. So the ministry of death had to be put away if sins could be put away, and if man would have any chance of reconciling or reuniting with God. So the old covenant law would have to go. And you probably remember, last week I shared with you a couple verses from Isaiah and Hosea. Hosea 13 is Isaiah chapter 59. When Israel offended in Baal, he died. You know, they were groping in the darkness as dead. You see, only a new covenant that wasn't like the old covenant, sounds like Ezekiel, only a new covenant could possibly atone for sins and raise people up out of death. And that's where we're going with this. We have to answer the question, when would this death, when would this separation finally and ultimately be done away with? When would this death be finally defeated? When would the adversary or Satan finally and ultimately be crushed? And do you want to take a guess when I'm going to posit that ultimate and final defeat? I think you probably do. Now, it may sound rather simple, but that's what biblical covenant eschatology is working towards. It's the end of the world, the old covenant world, and the entrance of a new world, a new covenant world, a world in which righteousness would dwell, because it's not righteousness as attained by the law, it's righteousness in Christ. A lot more could be said, but you know what? I promise you I'm going to keep these as short as I can, so I'm going to stop right there. Okay, I'm going to see you on the next one, hopefully in a few days. allprophecyfulfilled.com. Also, if you want to check out my, these are on YouTube under the same name, All Prophecy Fulfilled. You can subscribe that way. And stick with me on these, because we're going somewhere with these, folks. So we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.